Hello, friends. Welcome to the Christ and Coffee podcast. Today, we're going to cover the book of Exodus. We started this series going through the 66 books of the Bible. We covered Genesis last time, and you could check that out on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcast, Facebook, YouTube. We are on multiple platforms. If you've been listening to the Christ and Coffee podcast, please like, subscribe, hit notification buttons. The more actions we get, the more we could grow this podcast together. So the Christ and Coffee podcast is bringing the church together one coffee hour conversation at a time. And today, Jeremy is here to discuss the book of Exodus. How are you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, man. It's fun to talk about this stuff.
So let's jump right into it. So the book of Exodus, what's like the overview? Let's just start there. Let's get the big picture of the book.
Yeah. So Exodus picks up where Genesis left off. So Abraham's family that goes down all the way to Joseph and his 12 sons is now in Egypt, and they're not in the promised land. And so Exodus picks up with Abraham's family in Egypt. 400 years fast forwarded, and they are enslaved by Egypt now. Pharaoh is harsh on them. And Exodus is the story of Israel leaving Egypt, God liberating his people from the oppressive leadership, the oppressive empire state of Egypt, and into the promised land, or at least on the way to the promised land. So if you read Exodus, basically the first 18 chapters of Exodus are about this conflict, this narrative between Egypt, God's people, and God. And so the whole story is from Egypt, out of Egypt into freedom with God. And then the second half of Exodus, basically roughly like chapters 19 to 40, are all about the new relationship that God then forms and institutes with his people in front of a big mountain named Sinai or Horeb, depending on which tradition you go with. That's messy and confusing, and we probably won't go there. But yeah, basically the book's cut right down the middle. First half is about leaving Egypt. The second half is about settling into relationship with God and God giving them what we now call the Ten Commandments. There's like several different ways we could tackle the book. There's all sorts of different themes that come out of Exodus, but I'm wondering if you could just kind of lead us in a discussion of, what kind of themes are bubbling up in the book of Exodus.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to discuss. These motifs and themes carried throughout into the entire Bible. But I think ultimately it's an establishment of a nation, not a family now. So like as Americans, we like to celebrate our liberation from the oppressive regime of the British monarchy. So like there's this story that anchors the establishment of America no longer being a colony, but now being a nation. Even as Armenians, my name is Haig. I'm named after the father of Armenia, Haig and he liberated the Armenians from the Assyrian warlord and freed the Armenians to become their own independent people. So like nations have a story of how they came to be, and Exodus carries that story forward. It's not just the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's the 12 tribes, 400 years of growth of family and development in Egypt. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that there is this giant time jump. The 400 years is older than America by like 150 about years. That's a long time. Like a lot has happened since we picked up on the narrative.
Right.
And it's about God freeing an enslaved people group and establishing that covenant, which is a throwback to Abraham, to carry forward the narrative of Scripture.
Yeah, so one of the things that gets missed sometimes, I think, in Exodus is how deeply connected it is, not just to Genesis with Abraham, but how deeply connected it is to Genesis in its creation narrative. So one of the things that some scholars pick up on is how um, early on the conflict God has with Egypt is that they are destroying creation and using creation in the way that it's not meant to work or not meant to be. They're getting in the way of God's intention for creation. Um, and so in many ways, God is not just protecting Israel, but protecting creation. Like, what does Pharaoh do right out of the gate? Like, God's people are abiding, they're thriving, they're having so many kids, they're growing in the population, and Pharaoh institutes a genocide. He kills children, right? He takes life. And so it's very interesting that the beginning of the book of Exodus starts with this kind of um, conflict between what Genesis says was meant to happen, right? Be fruitful and multiply. And Israel is doing that, they're living that. And then Pharaoh saying, no, that gets in the way of my plans. I decide what's right and what's wrong. Boom, I'm going to kill these kids so that I can take hold of creation and have it for myself. So I think sometimes people miss the deep connection to the creation story in Genesis and how Exodus is saying this isn't this isn't okay with God. God's going to redeem a people who live in the world in ways that reflect how God wants creation to run and flow, and this is how that's going to work.
Yeah, and then from that you have the reason why Moses is sent down that basket, right? He's escaping this
Mm-hmm.
persecution,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
ends up into the court of Pharaoh,
Yeah.
is raised as royalty, as like the Prince of Egypt, and other movies have it's wonderfully portrayed.
Yeah. What's
Um,
what's so cool about that story is that it's because of Pharaoh's order that Moses is sent down the river. And the irony is that Pharaoh's order seals Pharaoh's fate, right? Because by the end of the story, that's what kills Pharaoh.
right.
Also, Pharaoh dies in the waters, and Moses is carried safely along the waters in the very beginning of that setting. So, yeah, it's interesting to see how God kind of turns empires on their head, um, and there's some rich parody and irony there in the way that the story is told.
Yeah, and then Moses ends up killing an Egyptian slave master, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Runs to exile. So he's already having this like out of Egypt moment,
Mm-hmm.
and then God sends him back with the
Yeah.
famous burning bush uh, encounter.
Yeah. Yeah.
And here's an important theme: God reveals His name.
There it is. Yeah. That's the first time we get the name, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Tell them I am sent me, and that's where we get the kind of stock covenant name for God in the Old Testament, Yahweh, which is a rough approximation of the Hebrew word for I am.
yep,
Yeah. And that becomes the promise name. So whenever people in the Old Testament, whenever the prophets want to recall fidelity to God, or fidelity to God's promise, they'll name God as Yahweh to remind them who brought them out of Egypt, to remind them who it is they have to deal with. It's not some abstract God. You kind of referred to that last week. It's not like some abstract God. This is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and this is the God who's brought them out of Egypt into this new relationship.
yeah. And I think it's so important because, uh, like, I remember, like, I became a Christian in 10th grade in high school, and um, I remember having a project where we were supposed to make a soundtrack to like one of the books we read. I think it was The Catcher in the Rye or something like that. Anyway, like there was some scene in the book where I remember being able to play one of DMX's songs. Like DMX, who passed away recently,
Yeah.
used to have at least like one Christian song in all his albums. And I remember playing that, and I like had that opportunity to share my faith in a high school classroom. And my high school English teacher got really upset at me. And I'm like this 10th grader who's like, you know, when people come to faith, they just want to share the faith with everyone. That was me. I was like super excited. And I was doing that in class, and I still do it. I'm not ashamed to share the truth of the gospel with people. But the rebuttal from the English teacher, I wasn't even realizing I'm having a debate with him at this point, was, um, oh yeah, if Christianity is so good, why does it allow slavery? And then if you like miss this understanding of who God is, like the defining act of the God of Scripture is liberating captives from slavery.
Right. Yeah. It's the second book. It's literally the next chapter, the second chapter. That's who God is. Yeah. No, I
Yeah,
hear you.
and then you have the Cappadocian Church Fathers making the first universal declarations that like slavery is evil, human rights is a thing, and they're getting these ideas from preaching the Bible. It's not like they're making it up. And this is some of the earlier human rights declarations that exist historically. And I think it's so important to not like just view this as, all right, um, it's a nice story. No, God did something, and this has uh, ramifications for how humans should be viewed. They're made in the image of God. God is a God who redeems people from oppression.
Right. And I just think there's so many ways to connect that. I think it's important to anchor God in this narrative, because that's where this is kind of one of the first times God goes public, so to speak, right? Like among the nations, it's the first time God shows up in a way that other nations will see what kind of a God he is. And so right here out of the gate, we recognize God as the one who hates the oppression of other human beings and redeems them from that. There's actually a whole theology that comes out of this called liberation theology that's very popular in South American circles and some African circles. And one of the values of that kind of theology is that it roots God in this character. The character of God is attached inextricably to the God who reveals himself in this Exodus story, taking oppressed people out of Egypt for the sake of not just the people, but for the sake of the world. I think sometimes that's missed, right? Like it's not just for Israel, it's for the world, because the empire, that oppressive regime, is destroying all creation by oppressing people, right? And I think that's another theme throughout Exodus is this kind of judgment of empires that thrive on the oppression of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, like the way God frees them is through like chances, second chances, but Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And that's a whole theological debate. Is it God hardening his heart, or God sees that his heart is hardened? Anyway, for whatever reason, every time God sends a plague, because he's disobedient to the famous line of "Let my people go," plagues are sent. And this is the year where like preaching from the plagues is probably like the best season. You had like the death murder hornets, you have COVID, you had swarms of locusts literally swarming through the eastern horn of Africa this year.
You had insane wildfires in the West Coast.
Yeah, it's been quite the year. It's like, oh yeah, that's happening.
So I one of the things I think that the plagues do in the narrative of Exodus is they deconstruct the myth that Pharaoh has control over creation, right? And it's a sort of it's like a death match between Yahweh and Pharaoh. And the question is who has the control over the creation and who doesn't. And so it's like, if you take that and mirror it onto us now, it's like this kind of arrogance that we have such control over creation or the world that we have influence over. And I guess the plagues kind of burst that bubble for us this year with COVID, with natural disaster. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, once they get out of, you've got the Red Sea, they part the Red Sea, they come out the other side safe. Pharaoh's armies are plunged into the waters. There's all sorts of good old like gospel hymns and folk music that come from that kind of narrative. What what on the other side? What kind of themes pop up on the other side?
So like yeah, you have this redemption, this liberation from the bondage of Pharaoh, and then on the other side through the waters is the new life. So Paul talks about this in his letters. He literally
Mhm.
takes this analogy for the convert of a Christian. I
Mhm.
was once enslaved to Satan, sin, death. Now I'm free through the other side of water baptism. I'm
Mhm.
now able to enter into this covenant with God,
Mhm.
this new covenant. So that's the next step. So from slavery to liberation to that big word covenant,
Mhm.
on Sinai.
Mhm.
And this is so crucial because it's not just a covenant between Abraham and God or the family. Now it's the whole nation God's covenanting with.
Mhm.
I think it's interesting to keep in mind. Usually, like when religions start, it's usually just some guy has an encounter with God.
Mhm.
Here you have a whole nation and having an encounter with God.
Mhm. Mhm.
Christianity, it's a bunch of people having an encounter. It's not just like one person be like, yeah, just believe me, I had this encounter.
Right.
Um, a whole people group are experiencing the encounter, and this is where God uses Moses to help that encounter happen, and that covenant of going back to Abraham to be continued. That
Right.
that through this people, nations are going to be blessed. You're going to be a
Right.
kingdom of priesthood. Yeah.
So yeah, so like so there's this theme of Moses leading a people, right?
Mhm.
Out of. So God is doing liberation, but he institutes a leader to bring them out, right? And then on the other side, there's this covenant process where God is now drawing near to this people and teaching them a new way of life in the world, right?
Right.
And that's where we get the Ten Commandments. That's where we get not just the Ten Commandments, but this long instruction list that will bleed over into Leviticus that we'll cover next in the series. Um, there's a pastor and professor who used to say, um, it, it's one thing for God to have taken Israel out of Egypt. It took God an extra bit of time to take Egypt out of Israel. So there's like there's this I probably just butchered that saying, but the point being that Egypt influenced Israel in such a way that it was worked into their system, their habits, their routines, their way of seeing the world was so embedded in them that when they got out of Egypt, there's a story in Exodus where they're like, man, we really miss Egypt. Like, we should just go back because we don't have the food that we wanted. Like they're hungry.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, so it's an interesting reflection on our lives too. Like, it's one thing for us to have been taken out of the the past habits and routines of seeing the world a certain way, but it's a whole other thing to be learning a new set of habits and ways of seeing the world with Christ.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we're quick to forget, and um, that's why it's so important to remember and not be ungrateful for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, People are weird, man. Like something really great happens to them, and they just misremember what took place, and they're like, "Yeah, my old life was better. Yeah, it was
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
really, really."
Um, so let's think about some of the highlights in the text. So we've talked already a little bit about the burning bush. So the burning bush is uh, one of the famous stories of Exodus. We talked about some of the 10 plagues, and we just referenced the 10 commandments. There's a lot of tens
Yeah,
in Exodus.
and there's the 400 years of part one, and then there's the
Right,
40 years of part two.
right, right. What are some other highlights in Exodus? Famous
Uh,
stories there.
I think we have to talk about Passover because it goes back to making sure we're
Mm,
remembering,
mhm,
and it's
mhm.
so crucial because like without Passover, Jesus' sacrifice doesn't make sense. Jesus died during the Passover meal, and I love how that theme continues of having a meal to remember what God did
Mhm, mhm,
because we're forgetful. So, and then going back to the opening, there's kind of like this retribution for the killing of infants happening
mhm,
now.
mhm,
But
mhm,
those who sacrifice the lamb, they put the lamb's blood over the door. They are free from the wrath of the firstborns of all creatures being killed. And it's a
mhm,
very gruesome story. But it's important because like this is where calling Jesus the Lamb of God comes in. This is where being covered by the blood, all that language is from this thing that happened.
Right, right. Yeah, and one of the things, blood for us typically represents death, but in ancient Near East culture, blood represents life, right? Like it's the life source of the being. So to put like the blood of the lamb on the door is to mark yourself as a people of life, which is ironic because it comes through death. And to have that as the metaphor to carry over into the New Testament, where Jesus takes that and applies it to himself and like uses it as a meaning making tool for what he's doing at the cross, it's very powerful. um yeah, it's
Yeah, and
also what we sort of mimic in some ways when we take the bread and the cup at Eucharist.
right, we used to proclaim the saving death of Christ.
Yeah.
We're part of the covenant. We are covered by His blood,
Right. Right.
because like we're gonna die one day, but are we covered in the blood to
Yeah.
be redeemed?
Right.
So yeah, so I
The
think that
Passover. Yeah.
Passover meal is huge,
Yeah.
and then the
Um,
covenant on the other side. I think those are the two anchor points to
yeah.
the narratives.
One of the things that might get missed is also there's the highlight of the preparation for making the tabernacle.
Yeah.
And yeah, tabernacle is just kind of fancy church language. I think the better way to say it is it's like a tent, right? It's a
Yeah.
tent. I think some traditions call it the tent of meeting or the
Yep.
meeting place. So it's kind of like a little micro Eden. It's a little space where heaven and earth overlap with one another. And the tent of meeting is supposed to settle in the center of the camp. And when they go out to march, it's supposed to be at the front. And there's a pillar of fire that's supposed to guide them and direct them as a representative of God. And so, yeah, that little uh, anticipation of Jesus being the place where heaven and earth meet is right there in Exodus, like guiding us, leading us in the desert. In fact, in John's gospel, in the first chapter of John's gospel, when it says the word became flesh and dwelt among us, the word for dwelt among us is literally in Greek. He set up a tent among us, which is to mimic that language of the tent of meeting. And when Jesus came here on earth, he was this um, presence of God, this micro Eden, heaven and earth coming into one place and
Yeah.
interacting with us in a way that we receive that life and then are then able to share it with others.
Yeah. And then once we receive that life, we receive this Holy Spirit, and then we become tents
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
of God's presence.
Yep.
We're the living temple.
Yeah. I think it was the Bible Project guys. We always kind of shout out to them, but they talked about it like hotspots. We become, like, well, hotspots are kind of outdated now. No, everyone has data plans. But when when I was growing up in the like early 2000s, you wanted to find a hotspot where you could get some Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, in some ways, Christians become hotspots of God's presence
Totally.
by
Yep.
abiding with Jesus in the Spirit.
Yeah, and the more hotspots, the more the world will encounter the presence, and I believe that.
Right.
But like sin gets in that way of the reception, and then when we jump into Leviticus, it may sound weird, but it's to like preserve that connection to keep the people holy, and God takes
right.
that super seriously.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that like it's now not just covenant, but it's literally God's presence is in this tabernacle. There's
Right.
God with us here, a God leading the people, God with the people. But it's interesting, they can't enter into the Holy of Holy. They're still not like there
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah. I think one of the other highlights is probably the golden calf story that people
Yeah.
are familiar with, which kind of goes back to that, taking the people out of Egypt, but not taking Egypt out of the people. There they are, they're waiting for Moses. That's actually kind of a funny story. Everybody's gathered around the mountain and God starts speaking to them, and the people are like, stop, like tell God just to talk to Moses. We can't deal with this. And so like Moses becomes the intermediary between God and the people. Um, and so when Moses comes back down after talking with God, you have the people worshiping an idol that they made for themselves.
Yeah, they break the first two commandments right away.
Right away. Yeah, right out of the gate.
Stop worshiping God and let's worship idols.
Yep.
And I'm as a pastor in New York City, like the raging bull of Wall Street is literally like a golden calf of the 21st century. No one thinks that like this still happens, but like people may not worship the actual calf, but people totally worship money here.
Yep.
They worship the material thing over the one who made everything. And idolatry is everywhere. And here, like God literally wants you to burn the calf and drink it so you can see what it is. It's number two. That's what it is. That's what happens, the judgment afterwards. And some people experience death from it. But idolatry is the main sin throughout. And this is like the first big encounter of the people of God doing it on such a scale. And then the prophets throughout, they're like, stop worshiping these idols, man. We don't worship created things. We worship the creator, the one who was and is to come. Like, and we do it every day. Like we attach ourselves to these man-made idols.
Yeah.
But they're not as obvious as ancient deities.
Yeah. I mean, so there are some really strange stories in Exodus. There are some oddities that I want to point out. But before we do that, let's do this real quick. What are some ways that the New Testament appropriates Exodus and uses it in the stories it tells?
Yeah, Paul does that retelling of the first part of the Exodus to covenant. I think it's in 1 Corinthians. I mean, even the first plague, I don't know if it's a direct link, but there's the water into blood. There's the water into wine, Jesus' first miracle. And then Jesus' last miracle is the Passover. So there's the atonement, like it's really the main mission that leads to the liberation. So you have that anchoring Jesus's ministry.
All of the synoptic gospels start with Jesus in the water in baptism and coming out and starting a new project, right? So Jesus is kind of the beginning of a new Exodus, like this, picking up on the story.
Yeah, Matthew says he goes down to Egypt for a while.
He goes down to Egypt
because young kids are being killed.
Yep. Yeah. So Matthew's gospel very intentionally reboots the Exodus story for you to see Jesus's life as a sort of new Exodus. I think Paul also in 2 Corinthians does the Moses thing, where Moses goes up on Sinai, and when he encounters God, his face comes glowing to the people. And so he activates that for part of what it means to be a people who reflect God's image in the world as Christians. It's all over the place. I said last week, right? You can't understand the Gospels without Exodus, and you can't understand Exodus without Genesis.
Absolutely, it's all connected. And I think just Jesus saying, "I came to fulfill the law." This is what it looks like. I didn't come to abolish the law, but fulfill it. That's huge.
And then in John's Gospel, there's the whole bread of life discourse, right? And that's all about, it's literally like Jesus is on one side of the lake with a bunch of people, gives them a bunch of bread, and then leaves to go to the other side, and they all follow him there. And he has a long discourse about what it means for him to be the bread of life. And so it's reactivating the story of God providing manna for the people in the wilderness in Exodus. Which actually, now that I think about it, all the Gospels have that story, right? Wait, do all the Gospels have? Yeah, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have the feeding of 5,000.
Yeah, there's two feedings, but I think they all have one of the feedings at least.
So the New Testament has a lot of touch points with Exodus that really give meaning to what Jesus is doing. Is a sort of new activation of God freeing his people for a new life in the world. All right, what's the strange stuff? Let's close with that. What are some of the oddities in Exodus?
I think we covered it, like the plagues, the like it's all foreign to our ears if we don't go into the story. But like they're super relevant, just like the golden calf is an oddity, but hey, stop worshiping money. I don't worship money. Yes, you do.
Yeah, yeah,
Like you worship something and you're not worshiping God, and that's
yeah,
still
yeah.
the chief sin. So knock it off, everyone.
Well,
But
yeah, yeah,
also like God's presence being in the tabernacle tangibly, like that's a little different.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, it's also, to our ears at least, it's also unusual that we spend so much time at the end of Exodus on the details of what the tabernacle should look like. Like
yeah,
it's literally like reading blueprints. You get
right.
to the end of it and it's like there'll be this many cubits and get these people. What is interesting about the story is that that the people who are supposed to make the decorations for the temple are given God's spirit to make the decorations. So it's like the artistry and the beauty of the space is like literally divinely inspired. Like God cares about what it looks like in other words,
Yeah, I
right?
remember meeting a fashion designer, Nancy Wu.
Uh-huh.
She was at a worship session, and like the Lord like revealed to her, I want you to start making clothing for children. And
Hmm.
she never like sewed anything in her life. Anyway, she became this like top designer for kids, wins a bunch of awards. And it's like one of
Wow.
these moments where like, oh, God does care about art. God does
Yeah,
care
yeah.
about having people filled with the spirit to do like architecture or
Right.
design,
Right. Right.
not just to preach.
Right. Right. Everybody has a role. Everyone has something to do. And I think also one of the interesting things about the way the tabernacle is created is it is again it's supposed to sort of evoke images from the garden. And so there's a whole thing of like scholarly debate about which came first, you know, the garden narrative or the temple narrative. And the garden, like if it's the temple narrative, then the garden looks like the temple. If it was the garden narrative, then the temple looks like the garden. It's like the chicken or the egg kind of story. um but yeah, the garden is supposed to represent heaven and earth meeting together, and the temple is the same. It's supposed to manifest that. So that's probably why there's so much time given at the end of Exodus to the like details of what this space should look like.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I'm in the camp that it's mimicking the garden.
Mm.
And yeah, I think it's like we have visuals for this in a lot of movies. Like I'm just every time I think Ark of the Covenant, I'm thinking Indiana Jones.
Indiana Jones, yeah.
And then, like
And the,
that's
and
kind
the
of how it looks
Nazi's
like.
eyes melting
Yeah,
in blood.
yeah. And then you have to be like, wait, I don't remember that part.
um there is one cool story that we didn't reflect on that's kind of an oddity but also just really cool. In the very beginning, you have the story of the Hebrew midwives who are told to kill every child that is born. Like if you see it's a boy, kill the boy. They're given that decree from Pharaoh, from the leader's mouth to their ears, and they refuse it. They disobey. It's like the first example of like civil disobedience. And what I love about the story is that all throughout Exodus, you don't know who Pharaoh is. He's just Pharaoh. Like you don't
Mhm.
get any name. You don't get like which Pharaoh is it. They don't care. It's just Pharaoh. Every Pharaoh is the same. But you get the name of each of the midwives, like the nobodies, Shifra and Pua. Like you get those two names as if to say like it, it doesn't matter who this, terrible, evil, oppressive leader is, but these two, you know, strong, disobedient women say, nope, we're not going to listen to that. We're going to listen to God, and we're just going to let these children live. They get named right out of the gate. I think that's so cool
That's really
in the
powerful.
story. Yeah.
Yeah, because they usually attribute him to be Ramses the second, right? Like that's the guy.
Yeah. Yeah. There's all sorts of ink
Uh,
spilled over which was which. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so yeah, no, it's really powerful. The God takes the least of these um, to use so he could be revealed. It's really, really powerful.
Yeah. And it's also, we're a little late. I mean, it was Mother's Day a couple days ago, but it is a testimony to like the power of, you know, inspiring women to change the whole narrative, because otherwise the rest of the story doesn't go forward.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
Shifra
absolutely.
and Pua. I wonder what those names mean actually. That'd be fun to look up one day.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely.
Because
Um,
Moses means out of the water.
yeah. They would be doulas. Is that the word people use? Like
Doulas,
the
yeah, they would be
doulas,
doulas. Yeah,
doulas,
midwives.
midwives. Yeah,
Um,
doulas. I was talking to my wife the other day about like all husbands should be trained as doulas because they're like the number, like the teaching breathing techniques to be
there
part
you
of the
go.
birthing process as much as they can.
There you go. Just
Just
in case.
just in case, doula dads.
Doula dads. I like
It's a
that.
business idea. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. But anyway, on that note,
Yeah.
on the doula dad note, let's wrap this conversation to its close. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Don't just take our word for it. Read the book of Exodus yourself. Hopefully, our conversation could help you see the narrative in different lights. But the goal here is just to provide that like introduction to a biblical uh, commentary for you to help process when you read it. And that includes for us too when we go back to these texts. And it's fun because we have these opportunities just to talk. We spend so many hours behind the scenes going to school for this, preparing sermons for this, to just nerd up a bit and not that formal packaged sermon while we have these conversations. So uh, thank you all for listening. Stay caffeinated, my friends. And again, subscribe, like, comment, and stay caffeinated. God bless you.
See y'all again.